So we can get started, I think, now. So want to introduce Raj Joshi to the show today. Thank you so much for being here and for being with us. I want to start by just having you kind of introduce yourself and your work. You are an economist. You have a very impressive career focused on organizing business leaders to make social impact. There's so many amazing credentials here. You were the former managing director of the B Team, which is Richard Branson's organization. You're the founding board member of We Mean Business, executive in residence at Oxford University's Business School, and you now have a recent venture called Bridging Ventures, which you just launched. Please just tell yourself to everyone.
Thanks, Jess. Lovely to be here and honored to be part of this community and at this critical moment in history. So much is going on. We're in a world which in many ways looks like the perfect storm of crises, with the climate crisis, with deepening levels of inequality, with the pandemic. We really are seeing the beginning of what requires us to dramatically transform our way of living and being with each other. And thank you for that introduction. I mean, I have spent a number of years working to try and transform business as the primary actor in our world that is in some ways responsible for what we see around us. But at the same time, my own work actually began in organizing, in activism, in social entrepreneurship, working with groups like the Global Call to Action Against Poverty, which was started by Nelson Mandela, working with organizations like Oxfam, who are out in their kind of humanitarian sector, and then most recently working closely with Cristiana Figueres and the team at Mission 2020 to put together an inquiry into the future of climate action in this decisive decade, really understand how do we organize ourselves to achieve this systems change that we need to bring about in a way that is truly collaborative and that transcends the confrontational approach that we've taken for so long, and starts to recognize that everyone has a critical role to play if we're going to make it over this next 10 years, where we have to have emissions by 2030, where we need to ensure that we leave no one behind, and where we need to do it in such a way that we also create a better world than we have right now. So a lot to do. Excited to be part of this conversation, hear more about Anthem as well and trying to accomplish, and happy to share more.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Talk a little bit about, you've worked with so many massive global brands, including Unilever, Virgin, Kering, Salesforce, HuffPost, so many others. Can you share a little bit about how important is it really for the business community to be leading and really making deep and lasting commitments to sustainability and also climate action? And also, if you could talk a little bit about the value and importance of public-private partnerships, what role they have to play, and how that's a real significant path towards lasting climate impact.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I personally believe that we do need to create partnerships that are putting people and planet at the center. We, for many years, have been working in silos. I think whether we're in campaigning organizations where we're looking at tactics to increase the costs of inaction on those with power, or whether we are working with business to try to drive up the energy going into innovation and drive down the costs of inaction. Where we are now is that we need to take a much wider approach. And for me, to anchor this, I spent 2 months during COVID on a field trip visiting some of the communities that had been impacted by the pandemic in one of the small island developing states that was co-chairing the climate talks, the NDC, what's called the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions. It's effectively every country has to put together a plan for how they're going to reduce emissions. And there were two countries that were co-chairing a process to look at those plans, and that one of those countries was the UK, which is hosting the climate summit, and another one of those countries was Jamaica, which happens to be a small island developing state. And almost when going there as a Scot and meeting Jamaicans, it was as if they were coming to the climate Olympics in Scotland, and not necessarily looking forward to our wet weather in Glasgow. But what I saw there was this beautiful example of a country that was already delivering on some of what many of us were talking about as the next frontier in development, which was around regeneration. How can we be the regeneration? How can we take a model of economic growth, which is predominantly built upon exploitation, upon taking from the planet and taking from each other, and shift it towards one which is about cooperating to conserve, to give more than we take from people and planet. And meeting with fishermen who were responsible for feeding the population because the food stocks had been disrupted, pandemic, but who at the same time were ensuring that they were protecting the boundaries in terms of where they were fishing to ensure there was sustainable fishing. They were protecting the mangroves to ensure coastal viability, and that they were planting seagrass to support the development of crabs and blue crabs and new types of species that could sustain livelihoods. For me, it was an example of this kind of ecosystem-based adaptation with sustainable livelihoods and nature-based solutions being delivered, by people, which in a way is an example of where we have so much indigenous wisdom all over the world, where ordinary people are actually getting on with the solutions, but that there is this gulf between what people are doing and their capability for driving those solutions, and where the resources are in terms of the capital that needs to be mobilized to really help us turn things around. And so for me, that was just one example of a race for life that is happening in Jamaica, where you have fishing populations and marine protected areas, and you have the private sector looking at how do you clean up plastics in the gullies and the oceans, and ensure that companies who are responsible for that are being held accountable. And then you have government and forestry division and intergovernmental institutions coming together. And if we can apply that in one country in the global south, in a small island setting, then why can these approaches not be scaled up?
Right.
And then more to learn from those places, and perhaps what we are learning in the halls and the corridors of some of these climate summits compared to what I saw in Glasgow. I think I learned a lot more in Jamaica.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Well, let's talk about COP26, or the United Nations Climate Change Conference. Share a little bit about its background, its history. What is its role or purpose? What is the value of a conference like this in driving climate action? And just kind of like, what is it like to be there? Like to be on the ground for some people who, are not super familiar with it or have never been to something like that?
Well, this year it was a little bit of mayhem. I hadn't personally been home to Scotland for 2 years, and I had a baby in the summer, and so I'd hoped that he would be old enough that I could bring him back to see his family, but he was a little too small. So for me, it was lovely to come home to Scotland, and I've just joined the Scottish Government's Just Transition Commission, which is looking to think through how do we actually make this transition to net zero emissions economy, but do so in a way which is equitable. I found the COP to be interesting in that we, for the first time, had a number of countries that could not be there. And so there was a going in where I think the levels of expectation going into COP were almost set quite low. And many of us were unsure of whether we would actually get what the world ultimately needed to stay on in this decisive decade. And I think the fact that we've walked away with 1.5 still as a benchmark for where the world is going.
What does that mean? Explain what that means for people who don't know.
1.5 degrees of warming. We're already effectively locking in 1 degree, one temperature degree of warming, and if we continue at this current pace, that's going to continue to accelerate and get to a point where planet can no longer sustain human life in our current way of being. Mm-hmm. And that's why we're trying to address this crisis, is so that we don't see extreme weather events around the world that are devastating, food crops and local populations, and we don't see situations where people are unable to sustain their own livelihoods, where drought, flooding can cause so much devastation, and we don't see large regions of the world becoming uninhabitable, mm-hmm. which is what is projected to happen if we don't act in this coming years. What we know now is that the science tells us that the upper limit of 1.5 is really, and even at 1.5 we're going to see impacts, and we're already seeing them in Bangladesh and many other parts of the world, significant impacts on people. But we as a species can manage a 1.5 degree future if we really invest in adaptation, in building resilience, and in many other processes. But if we fail to reduce emissions by 45% by the end of the decade, and continue to reduce them to get to net zero by the 2050, we will be in a position where the global temperature rise will run away from us, and we'll no longer be able to keep the world within that safe operating space, the Eden, which many scientists call the Holocene that we're currently in, having moved to what they call the Anthropocene, where effectively human impacts are the greatest impacts on the planet. Mm-hmm. So COP is really what COP is. It reflects that, firstly, 50 years ago, and as we go into 2022, it'll be 50 years ago since the very first conference on the climate and the human environment. So that was the first time when scientists in Stockholm started to come together and realize that as human beings, we are having some impact on this planet, and started to dig in on that. 20 years later in Rio, the Rio Summit, or the Earth Summit, was when the world came together and realized that this was serious in a number of different areas, and they created a set of conventions. One is the Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. So that was created 30 years ago next year. They also had a Framework Convention on the control of biodiversity loss, and it's going into its 15th year. It's COP 15, and the COP means Conference of the Parties to the Convention. Mm-hmm. So the parties to each of these conventions are countries, supported by non-state actors, and these conventions are designed to really help manage the impacts of what we're seeing. And so Paris, kind of in a way, was a breakthrough moment, because we created a global agreement, universally binding agreement, on how the world would go about managing emissions. And that included a 5-year mechanism to get back around the table and increase emissions for how we're going to reduce emissions. What Glasgow delivered was an increase on that, where countries are effectively agreeing to do that on an annual basis. So from an accountability perspective, that is a plus point from the climate summit. Glasgow also saw countries agree that we need to phase out fossil fuel subsidies, which is a major sticking point, and I think many campaigning groups have been pushing for real progress on that, because we should not be subsidizing those things which are harming people and planet. We should be incentivizing the things that help us. And then finally, we also saw the COP deliver a little bit on the financing. It did increase some of the adaptation finance. They did acknowledge that countries, particularly rich countries, have not mobilized the money that they said they would 10 years ago for some of the world's poorest countries and the most vulnerable populations. And I think that honesty between people has actually disarmed some of the conversations and created at least some space for truth and reconciliation, particularly in this next issue, which is on loss and damage, where we didn't see much progress. In fact, one country I think that did make a contribution, even though it's not a party to the convention, made a contribution on loss and damage, and there's a few philanthropic organizations in the UK and in the US and elsewhere that also are putting some resources there. But I think that is really an area where a lot of healing is going to be required, because we're really starting to look at not just environmental loss and damage, but it opens the door, at least in the human psyche, to the questions around what level of loss and damage exists in our society from the levels of exploitation that have happened throughout history, and how have we as a people treated each other, and if we can't put that to bed, if we can't accept and embrace and give truth to history, and come to terms with it, then it's going to be very difficult for us collectively to move forward into the new world that we all want to build. And so I think there's a process that the climate negotiations might be sparking, which can also help us perhaps in looking at how do we win the wider peace in the world. Of deep interest to me.
Yeah. COP was called the last best hope for any progress to happen for us to save the planet. Even listening to you talk about this, but just thinking about kind of living through a global pandemic, flooding in new areas we haven't seen before, wildfires, droughts, all kinds of things. It can feel kind of bleak at times and be a bit pessimistic. Can you talk about what are some things that you're seeing, different kinds of work in the sector that's really inspiring you and keeping you kind of motivated and excited about doing this work?
Yeah, I had the honor of observing a roundtable that happened between a group of young leaders and President Obama, and Columbia University, who were creating the world's first climate school, which I thought was quite interesting. They've
cool.
a university that is very old, have effectively agreed to create something at the same level of a law school or a business school, focused on solving the problem of climate change, with universities and other partners around the world. And to think back to the years when Manhattanville projects were created and coined to really produce weapons, and right. Human ingenuity was placed in one direction. What if that same ingenuity and innovation and connection and intention amongst various communities of people, wisdom communities and people, innovators and indigenous peoples, could be brought together. It's catalyzed by academia and other partners to really help us figure out how do we solve the problem of climate change. So that was quite hopeful. I did attend a few events at the COP where I saw a glimmer of hope and a lot of interest from young people, and also listened to young people challenging heads of state. But it was, in effect, what I saw was an intergenerational, intersectoral, intercultural dialogue where we'd effectively created one new table. And it feels to me that part of what people are walking away with the COP feeling was that the table we have currently is no longer fit for purpose. And we need a new table. We need a table that gives people parity of esteem, where power relationships are properly thought through, where women and men can stand together across generations. And I think there may be an appetite for that to happen. And I saw that beginning to happen, where movements like Fridays for the Future are no longer at the fringes and aren't just movements of young people, but actually becoming mainstream movements of people who really want to stand up for the future and are standing for something, not against something. And I think part of our challenge really is what are we all for? And it's easy to stand against, but to stand for requires some real thought and a willingness to take some moral courage. And so I think leadership is still something that we need to mobilize in the world, but I think the COP has catalyzed the beginning of something which we can all build on. And as we look at next COPs in the MENA region in North Africa, happening in Sharm el Sheikh, Egypt, then in the UAE, there's also an opportunity, I think, there to also look at some of these intersectionalities between climate change, human development, energy, which is worth 74% of the emissions,
Right.
and then conflict and peace, and recognizing that there perhaps are deeper connections between these issues. I know that Greta Thunberg and others have also pointed those out, but I think there's a time to really move the needle on that and figure out how can we transform our sectors, but also how do we create the environment, the enabling environment for the next economy to thrive in such a way that it happens within planetary boundaries, but also while maintaining a social floor that enables us to leave no one behind.
Yeah, it's interesting how sort of through the climate crisis and climate issue, it really highlights, the intersectionality between all other kinds of issues, global poverty, conflict. Like it's like really, I think maybe that's part of the reason why it's such a galvanizing issue. It really brings people together across a lot of boundaries of country and age and things like that. There was a pretty significant youth presence at the COP. You talked about that a little bit. You also mentioned the importance of indigenous communities in this work. Can you talk about some of those groups and kind of what the presence was like at COP, and just a little bit about how important it is to have those voices at that new table that you're talking about building?
100%. I think one of the most refreshing parts of the COP, and I have to say the level of participation of civil society was still at an all-time low, and I think partly that was because of the barriers to participation for many countries for whom their countries are going through a huge pandemic, and it wasn't easy to be there. Even for those of us who are not living in those countries, it was not easy to be there. But for those who did come, and for those who were supported to be there by partners from around the world, I think the indigenous voices were some of the most sobering, truthful, honest, and wise contributions at the COP. I know that, for example, there was a young activist who represented her own community that were living in the Mariana Trench, just off the Mariana Trench, and challenging the military-industrial complex, for example, that has affected those populations. But in the same way, challenging the very moral fabric of how we're building our society. Right. And I think there's something about creating the conditions where people, ordinary people from all over the world, have the potential to speak truth to power, and for power to receive truth and see it for what it is and embrace that as truth, and the ability for that to shift the needle is quite unique, because truth by itself, once it's naked and clear, it's very difficult to argue with it. And so I think we do have some work to do to make sure that the truth is being told, that stories are being told, that all that we have with technology and social media and multi-channel platforms for storytelling don't dilute the ability for people all over the world to tell their story and to help others understand what is happening in and around them and how others help them. And I think ultimately the decisive decade will be won or lost on our ability to trust each other, to work together, to collaborate across industries and sectors, geographies and genders and races and many different forms of diversity, to solve these problems. And so the COP can enable that, it can catalyze that, but the pivot now really that we have an agreement and we have had multiple side events, which is what effectively COPs are now, to that agreement, is to the action. So how do we catalyze action, not just every year, but every day? And how do we do that in our own lives? I think we said we should be the regeneration. That a regenerative future isn't something that off in the distance, but it's something that we can live here and now. And I think I'm already seeing that it's not just Gen Z that are leading the way, but I have a little one. But I think we're at the cusp of seeing a regenerative future led by individuals who are non-binary in their thinking, and the answer is not left necessarily, nor is it right. It's perhaps both and moving forward requires us to listen to each other, and to be willing to see the uncertainty that's there, but also to trust in each other. So it's an exciting time for humanity. I think we have to get things done. I'd like to see more resources going to where they're most needed. I think the way we make this transition is just as important as where we're going. Mm-hmm. That's why I've agreed to serve on this transition commission with the Scottish Government, because mm-hmm. I think there's an opportunity there to demonstrate what that could look like in a country which does have significant reserves of oil and gas, which does have significant capacity for generation of wind and solar, while working with universities like Columbia and Oxford and others. I think education has a critical role to play, because mindset shift, which Christiana Figueres talks a lot about, is absolutely critical. If we need optimism in this effort. But at the same time, we need solutions that, when we look back 100 years from now and we think about what we did, we created that new climate economy, that thriving regenerative future. We didn't recreate the same problems that have plagued us for the last. And that's why when you look at the encouraging news around electric vehicles and the ending of an internal combustion engine, we need to equally put resources into supporting civil society to hold supply chains accountable, to making sure that we're not sourcing cobalt from mining in the DRC where the human rights of children are being abused, or lithium ion from the Atacama Desert where the ecosystem is being destroyed. All of these are deep questions we need to ask ourselves, so we don't have unintended consequences from our. It is a hard challenge, but it's intersectional. It requires all of us to change, and it can also be very fun to do it in the process. We need to get planting trees. We need to get growing our own food. We need to think about what we need to consume and what we don't need to consume. Hard, right? Like, we're all going to go into Christmas right now, and everybody wants a Christmas present, at least if you celebrate Christmas, or if it's a season that you partake in. So these are big questions. How do you get the world to just change its mindset a little bit?
I like that saying, regeneration. I think that's a nice framing, a nice way to think about that. Before we go, tell us a little bit about Bridging Ventures. So Bridging Ventures was effectively a theory of change that came out of this process, the last few years of developing the Decisive Decade inquiry into the future of climate action and looking at catalytic collaboration for systemic change. And one of the things that came through in that process was, for me, we need to bring people together to help accelerate what people are already doing. And make deeper connections amongst unlikely allies who support to orchestrate the kinds of partnerships which are really going to make a difference. And doing that work, and as Elon Musk said, this week, in many ways, technology will be responsible for the supply and production of most goods and services, and what will be missing will be human connection. And so for me, I think that in a way what we're really trying to support is the facilitation of human collaboration and connection to solve problems,
recognizing that technology alone will not save us.
Right.
And therefore, what we do is we bring together educators and artists and investors and business leaders and activists and creatives to solve problems that we can't solve alone. Mm-hmm. And we do that by creating retreats, by creating digital sessions, by brokering partnerships between people, by advising individual companies and organizations on where they're going, having advised many CEOs and foundations and family offices, looking at questions like ESG and what does that really mean? How do you reduce your impact, not just measure and look at the data? So we're really in the business of helping people on this journey, the arc from where we are now to the world we need to create, how to accelerate that shift.
Well, that's awesome. Congratulations, and so appreciate all the work that you have done over the years. You've been a really integral part to a lot of meaningful organizations. So thank you for your work. Thank you for your continued work, and congratulations on everything. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.